Hey, how's it going? This is my first upload to YouTube in quite a while, and this is going to be a weekly series that I intend to do. It's called ThatsAdmirable. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about general stuff that's going on in Hearthstone, things that I think are particularly interesting, maybe some things I don't like, and a lot of things I do like typically because I think it's stuff that needs attention and stuff you guys should be paying attention to because it's exceptionally important. So the first thing I want to talk about in today's episode is Kinguin Pro League. It's been going on for 4 weeks now. We've had 8 shows be done, and it is pretty good stuff, I have to say. The production value is really high up there. It's pretty much setting a new standard as far as tournaments are concerned. We've seen a lot of stuff going on where it's kind of like cash grab stuff and people really trying to, get their hand into Hearthstone and try to get some worth out of it. But Kinguin Pro League is really something special. They have a stacked pool of players that's going into it, and a lot of weeks of action going on. I believe there's 10 weeks in total, and at the end of it, some pretty sweet prizes handed out, some relegation happening, and people being invited back. Kind of stylized after like LCS for League of Legends, the way that it's going to work. But this week, I'm not going to cover the entire thing. If you guys haven't watched it, you guys should check it out. It's on Kinguin.net, I believe, is the website. I have links below. I don't know exactly what they are, but I'll get them handy in the YouTube video, the description anyway, and you guys can go from there. I have an image that's also going to be handy so you guys can check out as far as the standings are concerned, again, after week 4 and day 2. But I'm going to cover specifically week 4, day 2 in this one and talk about the matches and sort of what I thought about it. Some of them are pretty standard and some of them are not so standard, and you see some kind of crazy stuff. The first match that happened that day was StrifeCro versus Masan, and this is really the one that I want to talk about the most because this is when I feel like Masan really could have put together a good performance here and done something unusual. So both these guys headed into it. StrifeCro had Warlock, he had Mech Mage, and he had Paladin, and Masan had Rogue and Warrior were the only 2 decks that were shown in his lineup. In game 1, nothing too terribly non-standard going on, as both these players just kind of playing a Warlock versus Rogue matchup. The Warlock, of course, being StrifeCro's version that he used to get number 1 on ladder a couple weeks ago. It's got a copy of Dread Infernal in it, which is really the most interesting part of it. And I've been playing that deck on ladder for a couple of weeks now. It's basically since I've seen it from him, and it's pretty good stuff. The Dread Infernal seems like it's really out of place at first, but it accomplishes 2 things that aren't really going for it in terms of handlock. The first one is that it's going to help sweep out Boombot tokens and contest the body that Dr. Boom puts on the board. And then the second one is that it's another demon that Voidcaller can put into play, another big demon that you needed. And part of the problem with all the other demons that are available, things like Illidan, for instance, which another one of the players in this week's lineup ended up playing in their demon lock deck. Illidan doesn't really accomplish anything. You have to play cards for him to be valuable. He's only making 2/1 tokens. The 7/5 body leaves him vulnerable to Big Game Hunter, which isn't a big deal, but it can swing some games. But Dread Inferno really just got everything that you wanted done with this deck, and I think it's something that's really special that was coming into it. So game 1, again, really nothing special, kind of a standard matchup. I expect Warlock to have a pretty decent edge against a rogue player who's not exceptionally experienced, someone like maybe Purple Drank, Firebat, or Hyped. All 3 of those guys are really big rogue innovators. But game 2 is really the one where I felt like there was a big point in this game that Masan could have made a difference. The board state that ended up happening out, by the way, if you haven't checked it out again, I'm gonna have links to the VODs below, and I encourage you guys to watch them. And don't just take my word for face value, really evaluate the context and see what's going on. But the board state was going into Masan's turn on turn 5. StrifeCro had a mirror entity in play, and basically nothing else. Masan had options to play Sludge Belcher, but that was his only minion on the board. StrifeCro's 1 minion, by the way, was an unstable ghoul that he managed to fetch off of Pilot Shredder. StrifeCro's playing Mech Mage, Masan's playing a pretty typical Control Warrior deck. And on this turn with the Mirror Entity, he actually decided to not play one of the Sludge Belchers in his hand. And he didn't have another minion available that was able to profitably pop a Mirror Entity, which generally there isn't a ton of ways to profitably pop it, but something like a Cruel Taskmaster obviously offsets it a lot better than something like a Sludge Belcher does. But if you took a look at his hand and the board state and the way the game had kind of gone, this was really the only turn that he had to pop this Mirror Entity and not almost outright lose the game because of how big of a swing turn it would have been. And he elected to not play Sludge Belcher. And then, of course, what you saw happen is the game just snowballed out of control, and he couldn't recover from it, despite the fact that he had Brawl in his hand. And I really would have liked to see him play this Sludge Belcher. And something that it really spoke to me on was his inexperience with Control Warrior versus Mech Mage in that sort of situation, or rather his unwillingness to branch out and try something new. Both of those things really were a heavy factor in this game. So what ended up happening afterwards is, again, StrifeCro just kind of continued to play efficient minions. He had a Toshli in his Mech Mage deck, of all things. It's something that I haven't seen in gosh, I don't know, basically since Mech Mage first came out. But the game was so in Masan's favor if he decided to play this Sludge Belcher on turn 5. And it's such a great example of how you can learn things from games, even if you've won them. And like from StrifeCro's point of view, you know, he very easily could have played just 100% perfectly. There really wasn't much decision on his end. The decision more so as to how he built his Mech Mage deck and chose to use it in his lineup. But from let's go back from Masan's point of view. Even if Masan had won this game with the way that he played it, to say he drew a Cruel Taskmaster and was able to proc this mirror entity with a Cruel Taskmaster instead of, say, something like a Sludge Belcher, if he had won that game, it would have been so important to go back and look at, well, I drew this Cruel Taskmaster at the perfect time. Could I have done better in this game than trying to draw Cruel Taskmaster? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. Again, if you guys go look at it, it was match 1 of week 4, day 2. Just something so important to look at is that sometimes you have to sacrifice more than you're willing to in order to get the job done. You don't need to be able to beat your opponent by 1,000,000 points of life and deal them 5,000 damage and have 66 cards in hand. You just need enough. And that's really one of the biggest lessons from that game that I think everyone can take away from it. And then, of course, last game, Masan queued up as Rogue again. StrifeCro was playing Paladin this game, and this one really, I mean, there was nothing Masan could have done in this game. If you took a look at the way his draw panned out, there was a 0 chance that he was going to win with the cards he was handed. And it feels really bad afterwards because he just came off of this loss where I feel like he should have won the game instead. But it's not the end of the world. You know, games and card games are going to be decided by the way that players draw sometimes, and there's really just nothing they can do about it. And unfortunately, this left Masan like not in the greatest position in the world in the league, but you know there's still plenty of play left, and you can go from there. He's 2-2, so he's not completely out of it. It still has to go ready to go. StrifeCro, of course, he's 4-0 in the league so far, though, and it's really absolutely no surprise. Touching on that real quick, there's only 2 players in the league that are 4-0 right now, and they're LifeCoach and StrifeCro, who are also 2 of absolutely no question about it, 2 of the best players in the world. Match 2. Though, this one was one that I was really excited to watch because you don't get to see a ton of Freser play. The first time I ever saw him play was at DreamHack Summer, one of my first big events that I was at. And Freser was really something special. He was one of the few people who came through the open bracket that they had there. He qualified, he got into the group stage part, and he put up a good performance. Despite the fact he didn't win that event, it was really something special that I was watching. So anytime I get a chance to watch him, it's really a pleasure for me. Because, again, you just don't see too much of him. He's not one of these super popular streamers that always gets invited to everything. He hasn't been extremely dominant in tournament performances, but he makes really strong plays and he understands why they're making them. And that's really the more important part of Hearthstone. When you're truly evaluating it from an objective standpoint and you're taking a look at the competitive sense of it and you're going, this guy plays really well and it's someone you need to look out for. So this match, of course, always something looking forward to. And Tice, I mean, this guy doesn't really need an introduction to the competitive scene. If you guys have been paying attention to it, he's, you know, a new addition to Nihilum, along with RDU and LifeCoach, and he has absolutely crushed it for basically as long as he's been playing tournaments. So, game 1, nothing too terribly special here. Paladin versus Warlock, again, one of these standard games that's kind of going on. It really goes back and forth, but the thing that I noticed was that Freser continued to try to attack the board position over and over and over again. And what he was trying to do is get to a position where he can leverage a heavy board state to kind of do whatever he wants. If he decides he wants to go for more of a control element, he's got that plan. If he decides he wants to go a little bit more aggressive, he's got that as well. And that's the benefit of fighting for board control. But again, nothing too, you know, hyper special in this game from a competitive standpoint or from a unique standpoint. It's really just both these guys are playing their cards really well. And at the end of the day, I think if you play Paladin perfectly, you can put up a really good fight versus pretty much any of the Warlock decks that are out there. Game 2, though, this is where it really starts to get ugly for Freser in this series. Hunter versus Warrior, and Tice is playing a copy of Doomsayer in his deck, of all things. And then something that I noticed is really, really strange, aside from the Doomsayer, of course, on Freser's side of it, is that he's playing a Face Hunter deck, and he has 2 copies of Explosive, no big deal, but he's also got 2 copies of Freezing Trap. And initially when I looked at this, I thought, what on earth is going on? But then you kind of take a look at the way the games are panning out, the kind of opponent he's against, because these guys, when they're playing in these Kinguin matches, they don't have to submit their decks for like an entire week or for the entire league. They submit it based on the opponent they're going to be playing against the next week. So they know who they're going to be matched up against. They can take into account that player's style, how they typically build their decks, and really build around that. And when you think about the way that Tice has traditionally played, which is he likes to play these heavy control decks, He likes strong mid-sized minions. Freezing Trap really made all the sense in the world, because one of the biggest problems he was going to have is something like a mid-sized minion, like a piloted Shredder or Sludge Belcher, or anything along those lines. Even if something like an Armor Smith is available, that's one of those cards that really puts a big hurt on aggressive style strategies. Something like Face Hunter. So when you have Freezing Trap to back that up, it can disrupt your opponent's play so much, because sometimes they'll have to check for like Explosive Trap with a weapon. They'll see it's not Explosive Trap and they'll go, oh, I guess it's Snake Trap and I don't want to attack his minions. So then the minion goes in your face and they find out it's Freezing Trap, and that can just so very easily offset things. So I actually think this is kind of a good move in this matchup in particular, with the way that I expect Tice to be playing. Again, very focused on the mid-range, making sure he's getting powerful minions down and trying to take advantage of that style of board position. Unfortunately, Hunter versus Warrior really just doesn't work out that well, especially when your opponent's got Doomsayers to help try to seize back board control. And I'm actually really curious about this Doomsayer. I think what it's in there for is sort of like a third Fiery War Axe style effect, where you play it really early on, you hope it gets some job done, you take a little bit of damage, so Fiery War Axe is going to have to attack minions, that's going to put damage into your face. And with Doomsayer, you're going to take some damage again from the minions, but it's going to explode and it's going to give you back board control. And I really thought that was something that was super important in that game and going forward. So Freser ends up getting bitten in the second game. Hunter versus Warrior, again, it's just not a good matchup. And then Hunter versus Hunter is what ends up getting played. And Tice, of course, he's playing Face Hunter as well. It's just such a good deck right now. It puts so much pressure on your opponent to build their strategies defensively, and that takes away a lot from what a lot of the powerful strategies are right now, which is focusing on the mid game. Again, things like Sludge Belcher, Piloted Sky Golem, Piloted Shredders, all those cards are very efficient towards the middle of the game. And so when you have a deck like Face Hunter, it's trying to punish that kind of strategy, things that are going to play Violet Teachers, stuff like that. This game, though, Freezing Trap, obviously not a very good tool versus Face Hunter. It's like probably one of the weakest cards that you can have. Explosive Trap's great. It can help get you the tempo, it deals extra damage to your opponent, it clears out some of their charge damage they have, but the Freezing Trap just really not very good. And I think that ends up giving Tice an edge in this one. But I think despite that, both these players played their matchups really well, and I think that they understood exactly what their game plans were and how the tempo constraints move forward, how that affects their considerations. And this was overall a pretty well-played game. Face Hunter is not exactly a particularly exciting deck to watch, but if you're really paying attention to what the players are thinking about and trying to get inside of their heads and seeing, what they're fearing from their opponents and how they're trying to take steps to prevent that or proactively attack that, anything like that's always super interesting. So if you go watch this game, pay particularly a close attention to how each player is thinking about what their opponent does that affects what they're going to do. And that's really the entire matchup with Hunter versus Hunter, typically in general. And then, of course, last matchup, Face Hunter versus Warlock looks really good for Freser in this game. But Tice's draw was just so spectacular. He was able to take full control of the board. He was able to sustain through everything, and Freser just kind of ran out of gas and petered out. Again, this one wasn't too terribly exciting aside from the different builds, the atypical builds that both these players had in one of their decks. Again, 2 Freezing Traps in the Hunter deck and a Doomsayer in the Warrior deck, which, again, I think it's kind of supposed to be in the same vein as something like Fiery War Axe. Take some damage early on, get control of the board, try to scale into your mid game, and eventually your late game afterwards. And then RDU versus Dog in the last match. And the only thing I could think about this match was, what the fuck is Dog doing? His rogue deck ended up having a big Game Hunter in it. I'm sorry, not a big Game Hunter, a Deathwing in it, and I believe it was a Toshli that I also saw. Also, a Dr. Boom. And I was just like, what the hell is going on? Why is a Deathwing in your deck? The game plan for Rogue is to stabilize the board early, push for the mid game, and then try to end with Big Burst. Where does Deathwing ever fit into this game plan? Ever. It doesn't work. Like, if you run out of gas, you ran out of gas. That's the Rogue plan. If you have Sprint, great, you have Sprint and you can refuel. But what is Deathwing supposed to do? You're blowing up your opponent's minions at basically every step of the entire game, and then at the end you're like, yeah, you know what? I ran out of cards. Good thing I have this 12/12 in my deck. Kind of important at this point, your opponents typically are not going to play big Game Hunter against a rogue because they don't have time to do it and it's not very efficient. You don't run a bunch of 7-power minions, so you're not going to get anything baited out, aside from the fact that you have Dr. Boom in your deck that you can play and get a big Game Hunter out of the way. But where is this Deathwing sitting? Like, it's going to get big Game Huntered so very often, even when you play it, because you don't have anything else for them to target. And if you're going into the late game versus control, your goal should be to burst them out of the game, not to play a Deathwing. So really cool that he's playing a Deathwing, I guess. But if you really look at it from a competitive sense, this just isn't a card that belongs in his deck. As far as I'm concerned, I am never playing Deathwing in Rogue with this card pool. I don't expect it to ever be a competitive force. I think it might just be that he's bored with the game and wants to try something else. I don't really know. I'd love to hear his opinion on it, but that was just, I couldn't think of anything else other than what on earth is Dog doing with this deck. Game 2, of course, Game 1, by the way, goes to RDU. They're playing Rogue versus Rogue, and aside from the Deathwing, they're pretty much identical versions. Shaman versus Rogue is Game 2, though, and this one, of course, anyone who's played Shaman versus Rogue knows that this is not very good for the Shaman. RDU kind of gets steamrolled in this one. Dog really just runs away with the game. It's one of those things where all the tools that Shaman is trying to utilize are all the tools that, or all the things that Rogue is trying to fight against. You know, small, but lots of board presence, so you can utilize things like Flame Tongue Totem, maybe even Bloodlust. Rogue just does so fantastic against those. Blade Flurry is like #1 problematic card for Shaman in this instance, and stuff like Violet Teacher and Piloted Shredders are not very fun to deal with either. So not a surprise to see Dog run away with this one. Next match, of course, Druid, one of Dog's favorite decks, and Shaman from RDU. This is kind of like one of those matches where the things that Druid are trying to do, Shaman really matches up good against. It's got a lot of spot removal, things like Hex. It's got a lot of cheap removal effects and things like Lightning Bolt or Crackle or Rockbiter Weapon. And Druid's trying to take advantage of a heavy mana curve. So one of the biggest plays that Druid has, of course, is innervating out a big minion. But that doesn't work very well against Shaman because they have Hex oftentimes for that big minion. So when you're using Innervate and you're using a second minion, you're 2-for-1ing yourself, and that's not the kind of thing you want to be doing in card games. And if you can't manage to close the game out pretty quickly after that, you're going to have a bad time. So this game ends up going in favor of RDU. Pretty much all those things just pan out. RDU ends up taking complete control of the board. Nothing that Dog can really do about it. It's sort of the nature of the matchup. When the cards pan out right for both players, I would tend it for the advantage to go to Shaman in that one. And then Game 4, Mech Mage versus Druid. And I can tell you, as being a Druid player, this is a nightmare for the Druid. It's like, if they get an early board presence and then they have a Fireball on something like a Druid of the Claw, you basically are just blown out of the game from there. And we see a lot of these games actually in the past come down to really, really close nail biters. The one that comes to mind for me, I think it was Savitz versus Tyson, one of the Kinguin events. It just came down to the wire, and Tyson needed to draw a single burn spell, and Savitz is down to like nothing, or vice versa. I don't remember exactly how it went. Kind of talking off the top of my head. But then StrifeCro, we've seen him play these games too. Again, it's Mech Mage versus Druid, and it just comes down to the wire, and it's like, does the Mech Mage have a burn spell? And the Druid's barely got anything left, but he has the board. So if he can manage to not die to a top deck burn spell, they typically win the game after that. But every single time I play it, even when I get into those scenarios as Druid where I'll have the board position but I'm dead to a burn spell, it just feels so awful to be in that spot. You never want to be dead to a single top deck from your opponent. So this one kind of pans out in the same vein. You know, Mech Mage plays a lot like Zoo did, where it just has tons of efficient early minions, and it kind of tries to snowball the game and really take advantage from there. RDU ends up taking this match 3-1. Nothing super special again in this one, aside from the Deathwing, which I just grossly disagree with, and I hope to never see in a Rogue deck ever again, because frankly, it's pretty terrible. Match 4, though, this is one that a lot of people were looking forward to, including myself. Trump versus LifeCoach, and I want to focus a little bit on Trump and how far he's come, and as a constructed player, in my opinion. About a year ago, when we first started watching Trump play, you know, he was mainly an arena player, a lot of streamer. He focused a lot on educational stuff, you know, teaching people what to think about and how to think about it, and, you know, really focusing on just not getting steamrolled in your games. That was really his main kind of forte back then. He played a lot of constructed, and you saw that in his constructed play. He was always so concerned about value, so concerned about playing safe and, you know, getting favorable trades and that sort of thing. But as he's played a lot more constructed, he sort of learned that, you know what, you have to actually kill your opponent, and constructed decks do that pretty well a lot of times. They're focusing really heavy on combos that are meant to burst your opponent out of the game and not really think too much about what your opponent has or value. They just want enough. Enough seems to be the biggest theme for constructed so far, because you don't need to deal your opponent you know, infinite damage. You just have to put them to 0, and as soon as they're at 0, they're dead. You don't have to worry about anything else. So ideally, the best deck that you could possibly have would use all of its mana every turn. It would end up using its last card on the last turn and take your opponent to 0 every single time, instead of putting them in a negative number. Ideally, that would be the way it works. Now, finding out what combination of cards does that, that's the incredibly difficult point, and that's what everyone's still trying to figure out. But he's come a long way since then. He understands when he has to go all in, but you still see a little bit of value kind of coming into his play, and and I think that's what's really hurting him in this one, because something that I've noticed does not work is trying to play a value game versus LifeCoach. He has so much insight, and he is so precise and so mindful of his game plans going forward that trying to outvalue him really doesn't work. The games that I typically see LifeCoach work is when the board state kind of gets out of control and he doesn't have the tools to deal with it. So I would like to see Trump use a more all-in strategy against LifeCoach rather than try to play a value game, but I'm not going to mind him trying to play the value game because it obviously is a very strong strategy. It's something that StrifeCro very often does. LifeCoach obviously is doing it a lot, and they're two extremely successful players. So emulating playstyles, always a good idea when you're talking about some of the best players in the world, especially someone like Trump who has a very good understanding of this sort of stuff. But in this matchup, I just have to say he's outmatched. Game 1, Hunter versus Paladin. If Paladin gets the right tools here, it just absolutely can dismantle Hunter, and that's kind of what you saw happen. Piloted Sky Golem ended up being such a big factor in the match, it felt like. Just not even necessarily it having an impact on the board, but having an impact coming from looking at the turn-by-turn basis. And it's like, if it goes toe-to-toe, he's got Piloted Sky Golem at the end, and Trump has Savannah Highmane, which obviously I think Savannah Highmane is a better card, but Paladin's got ways to answer Savannah Highmane, and Hunter doesn't really have a ton of ways to answer Piloted Sky Golem. So in that vein, I think the advantage does go to Paladin in the beginning, but then you kind of watch the game, and both players are fighting for value and trying to battle for the board really heavily. It just ends up going in LifeCoach's favor. Game 2, Hunter versus Mech Mage. Trump decides he's going to queue up good old Hunter again and give it another go. And I think this matchup tends to go in favor of Mech Mage. It's kind of like in the same vein as Zoo was, where just enough early efficient minions are good enough to get the job done. Like, overwhelming stupidity and overwhelming numbers should never be underestimated, and that's kind of the vein that Mech Mage is playing in. But again, there's Piloted Sky Golem in LifeCoach's Mech Mage deck, if I recall correctly. So trying to fight a value game against him is still very dangerous in that regard, because he's got fireballs, he's got frostbolt, so he's got potential to burst you from relatively high life totals if he's got any sort of formidable board position. And just again, the early minions, like if you don't have something like Eagle Horn Bow to start the game, it can really easily get out of control, especially when your big turn that you're focusing on is trying to get to turn 6. Now that being said, Trump isn't drawing the best in these games. He's kind of finding too many utility tools early on. He's not really getting his minions, so he doesn't. His plays are kind of making themselves, which is the situation when you play a value deck you're trying to avoid. You're trying to have options rather than a lack of them. When you play an aggro deck, you're trying to focus on consistency and a lack of options, and that's not what decision-making decks are trying to do. They're trying to have a bunch of options and finding the right puzzle pieces to make sure that the game goes in their favor. So this game does end up snowballing out of control, of course, in favor of LifeCoach, but Hunter, it's just, I don't think it's going to match up very well anyway, and again, Trump is not drawing exceptionally well in these matches. So on to Game 3, Hunter versus Warlock. Finally, what I consider a favorable matchup for Trump. It's just, he needs something to get going in this matchup. He's down 2 games, and this is the game where it has to be done. So in this game, the same thing ensues. It's like this huge battle for value and advantage the entire game, basically, until Trump finally ends up getting an edge. But it's in a really scary position that he does, because he's losing to so many cards in the position he's in, but LifeCoach frankly just doesn't have them. And he feels relatively safe in the position he's in, despite the fact that any number of draws can be really scary, because if you watch the way the game pans out, it's very clear that LifeCoach doesn't have the exact utility tools he needs to deal with the game leading up to this point. So Hunter versus Warlock, pretty much always a good matchup for the Hunter side of it. He's even got a copy of Hunter's Mark in his deck, so he's got multiple ways to make sure he's dealing with giant minions, stuff like Twilight Drake, stuff like Molten Giant, and it goes well for him. And then the next game, though, this is one that I initially thought Mech Mage was really favored in, because my experience with Mech Mage versus a handlock style of deck was that when you got them down to the 12 mark life, you usually had enough burn to kind of finish them. Since then, what I've been noticing is that you don't always have burn spells, and in fact, you typically don't have burn spells, or you have to use them on minions instead. Especially now that we've had stuff like Void Caller kind of be a staple in the handlock style decks. They're going to back it up with Molten Giant. Void Caller is in the same vein as Mountain Giant, in that it's a 4-mana card that's putting a lot of pressure on your opponent to be able to have to do something about it. And it always has the threat of putting something big into play. Even if it's something like a Jiraxis, a 315 body is nothing to scoff at. That's a lot of Dark Bombs that could be thrown at minions with a 315 body. Plus, you have to worry about stuff like Mal'Ganis. So this matchup, It's really a matter of whether or not Mage can get an incredible start and then have the burn to back it up, which you don't always get the miracle draw. Druid doesn't always have the 14-point combo on turn 9, and neither does Mech Mage always have 2 fireballs when he goes into turn 8. So this match kind of goes along those same lines. Again, I don't think Trump is drawing the best in this match, so there's not a lot of decision making to be done, but I do like his game plans in these games that he's been playing them, with what he's chosen to go with. I think I would like to see him play a little bit more of an all-in style versus LifeCoach, but I very much commend him for making his efforts to try to compete against what I think is probably the best value player in the world right now, LifeCoach. So this matchup ends up going 3-1 in favor of LifeCoach, and then of course match 5, which is another one I was really excited for because I knew that both these guys were going to be bringing in wonky decks. Kibler versus Show. And Brian Kibler, if you watch this guy's stream, he has a Golden Shaman. It was the class that he played the most early on. And lately, he's been playing a ton of Priest with copies of Light Bomb in it. And something that I was thinking about was, wow, what a fortunate opponent to be against someone like Show, who really likes to play Shaman and Warrior. You have decks that are going to be able to play against that class, which is kind of Show's bread and butter. Show's been branching out a lot lately too, but again, this guy's really focused control player. He likes to play heavier end minions, and he does it really well. He understands his game plans and matchups and tries to execute them, mulligans for the right cards, which of course is always super important. And game 1, Shaman versus Shaman. This is one of those matches where Lightning Storm is such an important card, and a well-timed Lightning Storm ends up deciding the game, which is kind of what happened. Both of these guys used a Flame Tongue really aggressively early, which I loved to see, because Flame Tongue is always such a scary card for Shaman to have to deal with if they don't have something like a Rock Biter. Stuff like Lightning Bolt's been getting trimmed a lot lately, sort of a footnote for that. But if they don't have something like Rock Biter, they fight pretty poorly against it because all your minions are just bigger than theirs at that point, and you end up getting Totem Control. And the Totem Control is so key to this matchup because Flame Tongue Totem. You have to be able to get value out of these small minions that you're placing on the board, or Shaman just really doesn't get the job done. So what you saw in this game was Kibler get control of the board, played a Manatide Totem. Manatide Totem was able to sit for a little bit, and that really kind of snowballed the game out of control from there. He was the first person to get an extremely valuable Lightning Storm in this game, and it kind of goes downhill from there. Show really has nothing he can do with this one. He kind of just got beat in this game. So game 2, Show queues up Shaman again. He's like, you know what, I'm going to go for it. It's a deck that I'm going to have to win a game with anyway if I'm going to win this series. That's the way Conquest works. And Kibler, of course, he's got Priest for this, and anyone who's played Priest versus Shaman really, really knows that Priest has a pretty big advantage as far as this matchup's concerned. Now, despite that, I was really surprised how this matchup ended up panning out, because Show just pretty much had the tools that he needed to fight against what Priest was doing. He ends up getting control of the board. He ends up fighting the minion battle properly and just gets Kibler to a spot where he doesn't have the range of options to fight what he's doing. Goes in favor of Show, and it's like super surprising. Anytime you see anyone win with Shaman versus Priest, it's really something special. So if you're trying to learn something about that matchup, like maybe you're a big Shaman player and Priest is something you've been struggling against, which I imagine you would be if you're a Shaman player, it's a great game to go check out. Again, week 4, day 2 of Kinguin. I'm gonna provide links below in the video for you guys. Game 3 now, Priest versus Druid. This is one of those ones, again, where it feels like Druid players have a natural advantage, just kind of the way the minions line up. They have a lot of mid-sized stuff that's very powerful. They don't have a ton of minions that are vulnerable to Shadow Word Death, which is one of Priest's biggest swing turns. And their early game can very easily match what Priest is trying to do if they have something like a Wild Growth or an Innervate. So they have 4 copies of cards that they want to be mulliganing for. If they find one, Priest is typically at a disadvantage in this one. And it goes pretty much just that same way. Show is able to get enough board presence to continuously fight what Priest's general game plan will be on their next turn. Just has all the tools to deal with it, and Druid kind of doing what Druid does. Once it has the board, it's very oppressive in how it approaches things, because once you start getting to like that turn 7 to 9 mark, Savage Roar is always on your mind, and it's so often that you're dead to a Savage Roar because it's 3 mana for 6 damage, or 8 damage, and sometimes even 10 damage or more. But it's just one of those board positions where it's so scary, and Show, I think, played this game pretty well, all things considered, and his build is, pretty straightforward. And Kibler's build of Priest, again, it's got these 2 light bombs in it, so he's looking for really big light bomb turns. That's one of the ways he can recover against Druid, but if you don't find one of those, you're going to end up losing the game. Hunter versus Warlock is the next match. Of course, this is in the favor of Hunter again. Anyone who's played the Warlock side of this kind of knows how this matchup ends up going. Kibler takes this game relatively easy, I would say. Not a ton of decisions from his side of the board. Pretty standard stuff going on. Sho doesn't have the miracle draws that he needs to kind of beat Hunter. Warlock always needs something strong if it's going to fight against what Hunter is doing. The hero power, like both of your hero powers working and Sho and life total, is just not a position you really want to be in. So Kibler ends up taking this game. And now the series tied up 2-2. And this is the matchup I think Kibler really wants to avoid, which is Priest versus Warlock. This is another one of those matches where it can get really, really dangerous. If you don't put a lot of pressure on your opponent, being a Warlock, they just get a life tap and then life tap and life tap, and they've ended up drawing so many extra cards by the end of the game that you just get crushed by card advantage. But that wasn't the case in this one. When you have stuff like Velen's Chosen in your deck, you can really put up some more aggressive arguments for it. And of course, 2 copies of Light Bomb, obviously not doing very bad versus Warlock. So this is one of those games in particular that I found really interesting, but it was nothing really special. It was just kind of a lot of unique spots they're getting in that you don't very often see, because you just don't see a lot of Priest players in competitive play. So again, for those guys out there who are Priest players who want to go check this one out, he lost 2 games of this Priest, but he did win one of them, and that's really all you have to do in this format is win 1 game with each of your decks. So despite the fact that he had a 1-2 record with it, I think he played it pretty well, and I actually think the list is pretty good. And I'd recommend playing it. There's also going to be links to lists in the description below, so make sure you check those out as well. They're also on the Kinguin website. And then, of course, the 6th match of the day, where I actually have a little bit of insight into this one, 6-0 versus Tice. And for this match, 6-0 was, to his explanation, incredibly tired. He actually told me he didn't remember the match very well when I was asking him about it. And he was on 4 hours of sleep, and he had to get up and play the match, and so he's not playing optimally in this one by any means whatsoever. There are actually quite a few mistakes going into it. As far as I'm concerned, not going to talk too much about him particularly, because again, I don't want to knock on someone who's not only a friend of mine, but also is, by his own claim, pretty tired when he goes into this match, and he's admitting his mistakes too. So, as long as someone's kind of living up to it, it's really all you can say for them. But if he's going to win some tournaments, he's going to have to buckle down, because 6-0's been hunting for a big one, and he hasn't had it yet. And 6-0 in this Kinguin League, he's 1-3 now, so he needs to pick it up if he really wants to continue to carry this, this weight of being one of these titans out there as far as the game is concerned. So this one just kind of gets steamrolled. This one he ends up queuing Demon Lock 3 times in a row versus Tice. And Tice's lineup, I think, is pretty well built to fend off against Demon Lock. I think I think Freeze Mage has an excellent matchup versus Warlock in this, which is what Tice is playing. Warlock versus Hunter. I think this can really kind of go either way. I would typically say Warlock has a slight advantage in this when they're playing Demon Hunter builds against stuff like Mistress of Pain. Maybe some Void Callers in there. They have a lot of removal to kind of disrupt what's going on. But Hunter is one of those decks that's just extremely scary. If they get the right draw, you're going to have a bad time. And that's pretty much exactly what you saw in this one. It's just really, really not going too much for him. Going back to game 1, actually, I want to talk about this mistake in particular that I thought that 6-0 was making, where he just kind of was playing the right minions, but he kind of got out of order at some point, and I want to say he played Loatheb too early in this game. Where you want to save Loatheb for is when you can pop a Freeze Mage's Ice Block and then drop Loatheb. So they have to deal with the board position and they have to play an Ice Block, and they can't do both when they're under a Loatheb, and that's really the spot you're looking for. Sometimes you have to play Loatheb to search for lethal damage, which I think is what he was trying to do, but at the end of the day, I think that saving Loatheb is probably a better game plan in that one, and I think I would have liked to see him do that. Game 3, Warlock versus Hunter. Again, he's queued up Warlock for the 3rd time in this one, and this is really the first time that we saw something really strange come out. Again, Tice is playing Doomsayer in his Warrior deck. He could have queued up a different set of decks for this one. He doesn't have to queue up the same decks that he used earlier in the day, despite the fact that the same day, they're different matches and you can use different decks in different matches. And he continues to use Doomsayer, which is really telling me that he feels like it's a powerful tool in the deck that actually belongs in there right now. And because of the tempo it can provide you and really gain you back initiative in spots where you might not otherwise have it. So seeing him play it again, it was a little bit of a surprise to me, honestly. I thought he was playing it in the first match because of the way that he anticipated the match kind of panning out, and having to use something like Doomsayer because he doesn't necessarily know what he thinks Freser is going to bring to the table, but against something like 6-0, he's going to bring aggro. So I was surprised to see it again, but at the same time, when you think about it, it really makes a lot of sense. 6-0 is going to typically be playing decks that are focusing pretty heavily on the board position. Doomsayer early on in the match can do pretty well against those, especially in a deck like Warrior, where you back it up with tons of spot removal so you can scale into your mid game. But 6-0 is playing a copy of Illidan in his deck. And I saw this Illidan, and I'm like, what's an Illidan doing in your deck right now? Like, we've seen StrifeCro play with Dread Infernal, so we know that that's an available option. And the Dread Infernal has performed very, very well, all things considered. And what's Illidan going to do? Like, this is a card that gets big game huntered. It doesn't provide you a lot of value because the 2/1s just aren't typically doing very much. Almost every single deck in the format has ways to deal with 1 health minions pretty efficiently. And it's a 7/5 body, so it's not even really withstanding a ton of damage. Like, if your opponent just has 2 minions on the board, you can lose your Illidan. Like, I would really, really, really love to see Dread Infernal in this spot. And I think if there was a Dread Infernal in here, it would work really well. Now, that being said, he does have implosions in his deck, so that could be a reason he's not playing Dread Infernal, is he doesn't want to sweep away his own 1 health minions when he has them on the board. But if that's something you're trying to avoid, you can just not play Dread Infernal when you have 1 health minions on the board. That is something that you can just do, but it might be something he's trying to avoid, is having cards in his hand that he can't play, rather than having options to, access to something like Illidan, where he does want another big demon body, but he doesn't want a Dread Infernal because he doesn't want it to get stuck in his hand. So I can see why Illidan's in here, but I think probably at that point, Illidan's probably just better served as another big minion and skipping the extra Warlock. I'm sorry, the extra demon that you may or may not need in your deck. So, not a big fan of Illidan in this matchup. He does end up taking this one against the Warrior. I think that Warlock can match up really well versus what Warrior does. Again, the hero power just provides you so much leverage that if you're able to kind of go 1 for 1, you end up crushing your opponent in card advantage. So Game 4 happens. Hunter versus Warrior, and I can't stress it enough. We've all seen this matchup take place. Hunter just really is not in the best spot versus Warrior in this matchup. If Warrior ends up getting any early tools, they kind of dismantle you and kind of run you out of the game, which is pretty much exactly what you saw. Now, that being said, I still don't think 6-0 played very optimally in this one. It's something that if you are a Warlock player, you kind of like to play these weird Warlock variants, or even if you just kind of look at the game and try to think about what players are doing and understanding why they're doing it, this is a really good game to go look at, because when you look at someone's play and you can't figure out what they're doing at all, and you have a pretty good game sense, you typically have, some reasonable things here and there, you can learn a lot from it. If you're one of those players that doesn't have that game sense yet, and you're kind of stuck in, say the rank 6 to 10 range or below there, go watching these players and emulating them is a great way to learn. But I wouldn't recommend in this particular match trying to emulate what's going on here, because it's some pretty wonky stuff that's happening. I think a really good matchup to go watch if you really wanted to kind of emulate strategies: LifeCoach versus Trump, Kibler versus Show. I think those are the 2 highlights as far as I'm concerned from this week. And of course, if looking at plays where players had some questionable decisions, StrifeCro versus Masan, 6-0 versus Tice. I think those are the 2 highlights for this one. So that's pretty much everything for this week. There's 2 more Kinguin events that are happening next week as well, and it's going to continue to happen until this league is done. I'm really looking forward to all of them. Again, I love the stuff that Kinguin's been producing. It's really kind of setting a high bar out there for all the other events, and that's something I think that's really important, because the higher the bar gets set, the better production value we're going to see from this stuff, the better Hearthstone tournaments we have, and that's really what I'm looking forward to the most. So, next episode, probably going to cover some more Kinguin stuff, not go quite as in-depth as I did this week, and have some more topics I want to cover, but I want to keep these down to about 35 to 40 minutes each, because I don't want them to be these marathons of listening that's going forward. So this is my first one. Pretty rough stuff that's going on. I don't have a ton of video editing skills. I'm working on it. We're going to get everything done as far as that's concerned, and I'm still going to be posting written content. You guys can check out all that stuff. Twitter's at ThatsAdmirable, YouTube, Facebook, Twitch. Everything is at ThatsAdmirable, and the website, of course, ThatsAdmirable.com. You guys are probably watching this on YouTube, though, so if you're doing that, if you like my content, you want to see some more Hearthstone stuff, subscribe here. If you want to keep updates on when I'm streaming or thoughts that I have, obviously the website's a great way to do that, and if you want to get in contact with me, it's Admirable at ThatsAdmirable.com, and Twitter is also a really efficient way to reach me. If you guys have any comments or anything you'd like to see in particular, feedback, always welcoming that stuff, as long as you're constructive. Don't just say stuff, have a reason for it. I always am open to opinions, though. I'm always looking to improve, and I love hearing what you guys have to say. So, post feedback here, tweet at me. Any of that stuff is good. Just have a reason for why you say something. If you think I suck, that's fine, but tell me why you think I suck, so that way I can stop sucking so much. And if you think I'm doing a great job, great. Tell me what I'm doing right, so that way I can do more of that stuff, and really focus on getting the things I do right in my content integrated, and things that I do wrong out of the picture. Or maybe improve them and bring them back into the picture when I do them right. So, thanks so much for listening. I'm going to have, again, more of these episodes up. I'm going to try to do them Saturday every single time when I post them, and we'll go from there. If things are going exceptionally well, I'll post some more content, maybe some daily stuff. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.